We're on the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Beis. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yom Tov. Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that if you're toeh b'dvar mitzvah, which means you're in the midst of doing a mitzvah, you can sometimes be so immersed in the excitement of doing the mitzvah that you can sometimes make an error about other things. And therefore, if you carry the lulav outside in order to fulfill the mitzvah, even though it's on Shabbos, you don't have to bring a korban chatas because it's called toeh b'dvar mitzvah. You made a mistake in the midst of doing a mitzvah. Amar Abaye lo shanu ela shelo yatzabo, aval yatzabo chayiv. So Abaye just wants to clarify, that's only if at the time when you carry the lulav outside, you haven't yet fulfilled the mitzvah. But let's say you fulfilled the mitzvah in the house and then you carried it outside. So then you're going to be liable a korban chata since you already were makayim the mitzvah. You're no longer a toeh b'dvar mitzvah. You're not making a mistake in the midst of doing a mitzvah. So now we're on the top of Mem Beis Amud Aleph. I think some people have trouble finding the place. Am I mistaken? Everyone have the place? Okay, so the Gemara says, I don't understand. The Gemara asks the basic question now. Ha mida'ag be'ei nafak be'ei. 1 second, says the Gemara. I don't understand. How can you tell me you haven't yet been yotzei the mitzvah? As soon as you pick up the lulav in esrog, you're yotzei the mitzvah. The Torah says, ulakachtem lachem, which means as soon as you pick it up, you're yotzei. So how could you tell me you're carrying it outside before you're fulfilling the mitzvah? Amar Abaye keshahavcha. So Abaye says very simply, if you hold the arba minim upside down, then you're not yotzei the mitzvahs. We'll learn later on, you're only makayim the mitzvah of arba minim if you hold them derech gidulam, in the way that they grow. So since the lulav grows upwards, the esrog goes upwards with the pitum, right? Or in other words, holding it upright, not upside down. So then you're yotzei the mitzvah. That's why when we pick up the esrog to bench lulav, we hold it with the pitum upside down. So because you're supposed to make the bracha over la'asiyah, so you're supposed to make the bracha before you fulfill the mitzvah. So how, if you're picking it up already, how have you not yet fulfilled the mitzvah? Because you're holding it upside down. So the same thing is over here. You pick it up upside down, and then you walk outside with it with the intent of turning it right side up. Since you're toeh b'dvar mitzvah, so you're going to be potter. So Rava Amar afilu tema shalohav chalhacha b'mayaskina kigon shotzio bichli. Rava says, no, you don't have to give that answer. I'll give you another answer. Even if you're holding it right side up, as long as you're holding it via another object, like a utensil, so then you're not in violation. You carry it out on a tray or something like that. So the Gemara says, V'haravahu da'amar lakicha dedavar acher shma lakicha. But Rava, we just learned a few pages ago, Rava said that if you're wearing a glove or you hold it with a handkerchief, that's still called ulakachtem lachem, it's still called picking it up. So why aren't you yotzei the mitzvah just because you're carrying it via another object? Answers the Gemara, Hani mili derech kavod aval derech bizayon lo. That's only true if you're holding it in a respectful way, which means you're holding it directly just via a cloth or a glove. But if you're holding it in a disrespectful way, meaning that you're not holding it directly but you're putting it on a plate or a tray, so then since you're completely disconnected from the lulav, that's not called ulakachtem, it's not called picking it up. Okay, so we have two answers to that question. Amar Rav Huna, Omer haya Rabbi Yossi, olas ha'of shenimtzeis ben agafayim, uchesaver chatas ha'ofi va'achla pater. So Rav Huna comes along and says, according to the Shita of Rabbi Yossi, if a Kohen is working in the Beis HaMikdash and he sees a pile of slaughtered birds, and the method of slaughter for a bird carbon is a process called malika, where you puncture the nape of its neck, and he sees a pile of birds that way, and he mistakenly thinks that this particular bird that he picks up is a korban chatas, where the Torah says that the Kohen shall eat a portion of the bird, and he goes ahead and he cooks it and he eats it, and then he discovers that it was actually an ola bird, which was meant to be completely burned on the altar. So it turns out that he's done an act of me'ila. So comes along Rav Huna and says, according to Rabbi Yossi, he would be potter over here as well. Because just like in the case of carrying the lulav on Shabbos, you're toeh b'dvar mitzvah, you're making an error in the midst of a mitzvah, here too you're making an error in the midst of doing a mitzvah. So my kamashmalan the toeh b'dvar mitzvah potter hainu hach. So the Gemara says, Shkoyach Rav Huna, what are you telling me that I don't already know? In other words, why would I think that this is any different from the case that was cited by Rabbi Yossi himself? Mahu de tema hasam hu de tabit var mitzvah pater hainu de avid mitzvah aval hacha de tabit var mitzvah v'lo avid mitzvah imalo kamash malan. Because you might have thought that the only time that Rabbi Yossi lets you off the hook from bringing a korban chatas is if you make a mistake in the process of doing a mitzvah and you succeed in doing a mitzvah. Like in the case of lulav, where I accidentally carry it outside and then I pick it up and I shake lulav. So I've done the mitzvah and I give the guy a free pass because he was so distracted from doing a mitzvah and he actually did a mitzvah. I give him an exemption from a korban chatas. But in the case over here, are you actually doing a mitzvah? You ate a bird that you weren't allowed to eat. You thought you were doing a mitzvah, but the reality is you didn't do a mitzvah. So you might have thought that in that situation, Rabbi Yossi doesn't give you a free pass because you never ended up doing a mitzvah. Kamash malan, that as long as you were far dreit and far shteit, is that the right? Did I say it right, Mr. Gruda? Right? That as long as you were distracted and you were a bit famished, what else would you say? Famished, far dreit.
This is the same meaning.
Yeah, I figured. Good. Thank you, yeah. Thank you. I'm learning. I'm learning from you all the time. Right? As long as you get you're very fatumeld and fardreit and another one. Keep them coming. That's right. Right. So as long as because you're distracted and you think it, even if you think you're doing a mitzvah, Rabbi Yossi holds that you're off the hook. So the Gemara now challenges that. Meisvei. Rabbi Yossi Omer Hashochet es hatamid she'ena mevukar kehilchasu b'Shabbos chayiv chatas v'tzarech tamid acher. So the Brisa seems to contradict what Rav Huna just said, because the Brisa tells us that according to Rabbi Yossi, if a person takes an animal that has not been checked for blemishes and he shechts it on Shabbos for the korban tamid in the Beis Hamikdash, and then it turns out that it's blemished and it cannot be used as a korban, so the halacha is that such a person is liable for a korban chatas, and he has to bring another korban tamid. I guess it could be that he has to financially replace it. I'm not sure whether if it's Arch Tamid Acher implies that or not. But the point is, you obviously need to bring another korban tamid. So the question is, according to you, why should he have to bring a korban chatas, Rabbi Yossi? He's in the middle of doing a mitzvah, so why don't you give him a free pass? So the Gemara says, Amar lei bar mina dehahi. So Rav Huna will tell you that no, that's a different case. Why? Because the ha'itmar Allah, Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chatoy, Amar Rav Hamnuna Saba, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashiyan, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, Kigon she'hiviu melishka she'inon mevukarin. That's a case where a guy was so negligent that he went into a chamber where there were animals that had not even been checked to make sure that they were blemish-free. You see, usually when you want to bring an animal on Shabbos for a korban, you check the animals 4 days in advance, and you make sure that they're free from any blemish, and you put them in a special room of checked animals. But there's another chamber of animals that have not been checked yet. So this Shlemiel went ahead and went into the chamber of animals that had not been checked. He has been so negligent that that's beyond the realm of acceptable error. That's like Rashi says, it's karov lemezid. It's almost like it's a much grosser act of negligence. When there's a small margin of error and you're fardreit in the process of doing a mitzvah, so then we let you off the hook from a korban chatas because of your diversions and your distractions from the engrossment in a mitzvah. But when it's such a gross error that you should have really been you should have had a modicum of caution in making sure you got the animal from the right chamber, there we're not going to let you off the hook, and even when you're in the midst of doing a mitzvah, we're going to make you liable. Okay, let's go weiter in the Mishnah. Mekabeles isha miyad bina umiyad baila umachzirasu l'mayim b'Shabbos. So really, our Mishnah is actually telling me two halachas in this statement. Number one, it's telling me that a woman is allowed to receive the lulav after her husband or her son is finished using it on Yontif or on Shabbos. Okay? Now, why would I think that she's not allowed to? I might think that for her it's muktzah, because she doesn't have an obligation to shake it. So that's the first chiddush, that she's allowed to. She's allowed to hold it. It's not muktzah for her. Number two is that if she wants to return it to water to keep it fresh, she has every right to do so, both on Yontif and on Shabbos. She can return it back into the water. So that's the second chiddush, that there's no isser of zriya by just returning a already harvested vegetation into water. There's no problem with that. To put it back in the soil, there for sure is a problem. But to put it just back into water to keep it moist, that's not a problem. That's not called planting it.
To keep it fresh.
To keep it fresh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'Shabbos machzirin b'Yom Tov mosifin u'v'moed machlifin. And Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll go even further. On Shabbos, you're allowed to return it to its water. On Yontif, you can even add water. And on Chol HaMoed, you can even change the water. And probably not only can you, but you should, in order to preserve it, to make sure that it'll stay fresh for all 7 days. And finally, the Mishnah says, Katan ha-yodeya linaneya chayev b'lulav. That as soon as a child reaches the age where he knows how to shake, then I as a father have to provide my son with a lulav in order to have him shake it and fulfill the mitzvah. So the Gemara now says, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to buy him a separate lulav. It means that I have to provide him with a lulav, and I can give him a matanal manas lahachzir, or a number of different other things in the situation where it's too expensive for me to have one both for myself and for my child. So the Gemara now says, Pshita. So first of all, what's the chiddush of telling me that a woman is allowed to take the lulav from her husband or her son on Yontif or Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Mahu detei mahol v'ishalav bas chiyu v'hi emalo tekabel. You might have thought that since she's not obligated in the mitzvah, then for her it should be muktzah, since she's patur from the mitzvah, right? So therefore, kamash malan, the answer is no, that since for her husband it's considered to be an item of a mitzvah, it's a kli now, so since it's not muktzah for her husband, it's not muktzah for her either. And this is a very important halacha, that once something is not muktzah for one person, it can't be muktzah for another person as long as they're within the same circle within the same social circle. It's an important halacha to remember. I remember reading a tshuva from Reb Moshe years ago, so I'm a little bit vague on it, but there's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that a person is not supposed to read fiction on Shabbos, fiction novels and stuff like that, literature. Now, as to why people are not so careful in this halacha is another discussion, not for now. But many people are lenient in this regard. Reb Moshe wrote a tshuva years ago stating that if you're visiting a home where there are novels, paperback novels in the house that people read on Shabbos, even though you don't read them in your house, but those books are not muktzah, because since the people in that house read them on Shabbos, they're not muktzah. So as long as something is not muktzah for that person, it's not muktzah for you either. Okay? Let's go weiter. Katan hayodeya linaneya. A child, once he reaches the age of education, you have an obligation to educate him and teach him and train him and give him a lulav to shake. Tanu Rabbanan. Katan hayodeya linaneya chayev b'lulav. So the Bryce is going to go through different things that you have to do for your child for the sake of education. Once he knows how to shake, you have to give him a lulav. Once he knows how to responsibly put on a pair of tzitzis, talis cotton, you have to give him tzitzis. Lishmor tefillin aviv lokeach lo tefillin. Once the child is old enough to protect the tefillin from being placed in a dirty place like a bathroom, the child is responsible enough to protect it, so you have to give him a pair of tefillin. Now, the reason why we don't do this is for another reason, that we don't go like this Bryce when it comes to tefillin. We wait until right before the bar mitzvah, which is, so therefore just keep that in mind.
Maybe it means something else, that he should not be, that he could take it from one place to the other.
Well, I'm just quoting to you Rashi. Rashi says that as long as he knows not to bring it into a bathroom, so then he's responsible. Yodeya ledaber aviv lomdo Torah ukriyashma. As soon as the child knows how to speak, the father has an obligation to teach him Torah and teach him to recite Kriya Shema. Torah Maihi Amar Rav Hamnuna Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Marasha Kilas Yaakov. So what do you mean he's that the father has to teach him Torah? Because obviously if the child's just starting to speak, he can't start learning Maseches Uktzin. So what you'll do is you'll start him off with the very basic pasuk so that he can just mouth the words, he can just parrot the words. So you teach him the very first pasuk of Torah Tzvi V'lanu Moshe Marasha Kilas Yaakov, which is the fundamental principle of that we have a Mesorah that comes from Har Sinai of the Torah. And that's why we put it into a song, so that the children should be able to learn it. Kriya Shema Maihi Pasuk Rishon. What's the mitzvah of Kriya Shema? You don't have to exhaust yourself to train your 3-year-old to say all 3 paragraphs of Shema's. Just the first line of Kriya Shema. Hayodea lishmor gufo ochlan al gufo taharos, lishmor es yadav ochlan al yadav taharos. This is really a double halacha, and it's based on the laws of Tumah. Once a child is old enough to preserve his body from Tumah, so then we trust him if his body touches something that's tohar, that it's not tameh. And once a child is able to protect his hands from tumah, so then we trust him if his hands touch something that's tohar, that we assume that it remains tohar. So let me just explain why body and hands are 2 separate categories. Really, midioraisa, your hands are no different from the rest of your body. But the Rabbanan were gozer, and we've seen this a number of times already, the Rabbanan were gozer that yadayim shniyosein, that your hands have a din of a sheni l'tumah, and whatever they touch, if there's a liquid in between, if they touch a liquid, so then that liquid becomes a rishon l'tumah, and if their hands touches a truma, the truma will become a shlishi, which will make it tameh. So that's what Chazal were gozer, and they're required, therefore, that a person has to do netilas yadayim before handling any taharos, before handling anything that's tahar, for this regard. So let's say a child is old enough to protect his body from coming into contact with tumah dioraisa, but he's not yet mature enough to wash his hands every time he handles taharos. So then, if his body touches something that's tohar, we don't assume that he's made it tameh, because we assume the child has kept his body tohar, even if he's not old enough to keep his hands clean. But if his hands touch something, so then we have to get worried that it may have become tameh, midirabanan. But once he becomes a little bit older and he's able to wash it, he's responsible enough to always wash his hands before touching any taharos, so then we assume that anything that he touches is also tahar. Next, Hayodea lishoel b'rishus hayachid sveiko tami b'rishus harabim sveiko tohar. Another important halacha is as follows. We learn this in Maseches Sota. We learn from the laws of the Sota that if there's a suffix as to whether a person has become tameh or not, so then it all depends on where the suffix took place. If the suffix took place in a rishus hayachid, in a private domain, so then the assumption is that the person is tameh. If the suffix takes place in a rishus harabim, the assumption is that the person is tahor. So the Gemara clarifies that this halacha, which is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, is only based on a human being who has enough ability to communicate. But if you're dealing with a human being who cannot communicate, meaning he cannot respond to questions and answer intelligently, or if you're dealing with an animal like a sheretz, so then, or an inanimate object like a kli, so since you cannot communicate with that object or that person or that animal, so therefore we always assume that a suffix tumah is tahor, is going to be tahor, regardless of whether it's in a rishus hayachid or a rishus harabim. So what about a child? So as soon as the child is able to answer questions intelligently, so he assumes the status of a regular human being who can communicate, and therefore if he has a suffix tumah in rishus hayachid, his sfeiko is tameh. Next, hayodea lifros kapav cholkin lo truma beveis agranos. The next halacha has to do with a kohen, a child kohen who is duchening. Here, according to Tosfos, we're dealing again with a child who's under bar mitzvah, and his father will take him to duchen with him. Once the child has demonstrated publicly that he's a kohen by duchening, so then he can join his father and go to the threshing barn of the local farmers and get his own portion of truma. But if he's not old enough to duchen and demonstrate that he's a kohen, he's allowed to eat truma, but he's not allowed to go and get his own portion. He has to wait for his daddy to come home and to take a portion from daddy's truma, just like a mommy and his sisters. But once he's old enough that he can duchen on his own, right? So then he gets to go with his father and get his own independent portion. Next, hayodea lishchot olchen mishachitasa. Once a child is old enough to be able to handle a chalaf, to be able to handle a shechita knife, we allow him to shecht and we assume it's kosher. And Amar Rav Huna v'hu shegadol omid al gabav. That's provided that an adult is supervising him to make sure that he doesn't mishandle the process of shechita. Yachol lechol kazayis dagan marchikin meitzawasu umeimei raglav arba amos. Once a child, or this is really a toddler, is old enough to eat a kazayas of grain, or grain product, so then we assume that his excrement has an offensive odor, and therefore you have to distance yourself at least 4 amos from his excrement, from either his urine or his feces, in order to be able to lein Kriya Shema or to daven Shmona Esrei. Before that age, by the way, then you know if you've ever changed a baby's diaper, if it's an infant and he's just having milk, so then the feces, this does not have as offensive of an odor. So, Amar Rav Chisda, v'hu sheyachol la'achlo b'chdei achilas pras. And Rav Chisda says that's provided that he's able to eat the kazayas of grain within a certain amount of time called kedei achilas pras, which is the amount of time that it takes to eat a half a loaf of bread, like a meal. So, because if not, then it's not considered to be the child is really eating enough grain to putrefy his feces. Amar Rav Chia berei de Rav Yeba uvagadol afal pi she'ena yachol lechol b'chdei achilas pras. If the person in question is an adult, he's not a baby, but he's an adult, then even if the adult, let's say, has a gluten-free diet and is not able to eat grain, nevertheless their feces and urine is considered to be putrid, even regardless of their diet. And how do I know this? Because there's a very profound principle mentioned in Koheles, which is that the more knowledge you have, the more putrid your waste product is, the more putrid your excrement is. Meaning that as the more sophisticated the organism, the more foul its waste product is, which is a very profound idea, because the more sophisticated you are, the more you're able to remove only goodness and reject the waste. Okay. Yachol lechol kazayis tzli shochten alavis hapesach. Once a child is capable of eating a kazayas of roasted meat, which is obviously have to be a little older to eat roasted meat than boiled meat, so then he can be counted as one of the members of the chabura for shechting the korban pesach. Shenamar ish lefi ochlo, that each person is counted based on his ability to eat. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheyachol levarer achila, that Rabbi Yehuda says you need a little bit more than that. Not only can he eat roasted meat, but he also has to be intelligent enough to know what is food and what is not food. Keitzad nosin lo tzuror v'zarko egos v'nolo. So if the child is intelligent enough that if you give him a rock, he'll throw it down, and if you give him a nut, he'll eat it, then you know that he's capable of being counted as part of the chabura. But let's say, you give him a rock and he tries to nibble on it, so then you know the kid is not intelligent enough yet to be counted as part of the chabura. So even if he could eat roasted meat, he's not old enough. Hajun alach lulav hagaza. Okay, very good. Let's go on to the next. This is a nice long Mishnah. This is the parak called Lulav Va'arava. Now, in order to understand this, I want to just re-clarify that there is a mitzvah d'oraisa in the Beis HaMikdash to take the Arba Minim all 7 days, and there's a mitzvah d'oraisa outside the Beis HaMikdash to take the Arba Minim only the first day. Do you remember that? We talked about this. Ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon is in the Gevulim, is outside the temple. Inside the temple there's a mitzvah d'oraisa for all 7 days. And another thing that we need to know is that there was a minhag in the temple that each one of the 7 days of Sukkot, they would parade around the Mizbeach with an arava, with a long willow branch. This was in addition to walking with a lulav and esrog. Okay, this was not just the arava that was part of the Arba Minim, but it was a separate arava that was very, very tall, much taller than the aravas that we have, right? And they would walk around to the Mizbeach with those aravas. Now, lulav va'arava shisha v'shiva. So, the mitzvah of lulav and arava in the temple is either 6 days or 7 days. And the Gemara will clarify that certain years you'll be using it for 6 days in the temple, and some years you'll be using it for all 7 days of Sukkot. Hahalal v'hasimcha shmona. How many days over Sukkot do you recite Hallel? It's all for all 8 days, meaning the 7 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, you recite full Hallel each day. And like Rashi points out, the reason why it's different from Pesach is because each day of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres is a different korban. Whereas on Pesach the korbanos are the same, so the level of acknowledgement to Hashem is not as great. Now, Sukkah v'nisuch hamayim shiva, the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah applies for all 7 days. And the mitzvah of nisuch hamayim, of doing water libations in the morning on each day of Sukkot with the korban tamid, which we'll learn about later, applies for all 7 days. By the way, I left out the word simcha. The word simcha, which I said applies all 8 days, is there's a mitzvah of eating the meat of korban shlamim for all 8 days of Sukkot. And then we go on to the mitzvah of sukkah, and pouring the water is for all 7 days of Sukkot, but not on Shmini Atzeres. And then we go on, hachalil chamisha v'shisha. The playing of the flute for the Simchas Beis HaShoeva would only apply during Chol HaMoed, but did not apply on Yontif. Sometimes it would be for 5 days of Chol HaMoed, and sometimes for 6 days. That means if Shabbos fell out during Chol HaMoed, since you didn't do a Simchas Beis HaShoeva on Shabbos either, there would only be 5 days of Chol HaMoed where you could play the flute. And if Shabbos fell out on the first day of Sukkot, so then you'd have all 6 days of Chol HaMoed for the Chalil. Lulav Shiva Ketzad. So what do we mean when we say that sometimes you can take the lulav for all 7 days? Ketzad. What's the illustration? Yom Tov Arishon Shel Chag Shechal Lios B'Shabbos Lulav Shiva Ushar Kol Hayomim Shisha. That if Shabbos coincides with the first day of Sukkot, so since the first day of Sukkot is more important to take the lulav than all the other days in the Beis HaMikdash, we override Shabbos to let you take lulav even on Shabbos, but only when it's the first day. And therefore you'll end up taking lulav all 7 days of Sukkot. But when Shabbos falls out any other day than the first day, so then we don't allow you to take lulav on that day, even in the Beis HaMikdash, and it'll turn out that there's only 6 days of taking lulav that year. Arava Shiva Ketzad, Yom HaShvi Shel Arava Shechalios B'Shabbos, Arava Shiva, Ushar Kol Hayomim Shisha. When we talk about the Arava, it's just the converse. There's a mitzvah to take it for all 7 days, but if it's Shabbos, you don't take the Arava, unless what? Unless Shabbos coincides with Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot. There's a special mitzvah of taking the Arava, so much so that it even overrides Shabbos, in which case you'll take it all 7 days. Mitzvahs Lulav Ketzad. So what was the original way that they did the mitzvah of Lulav in the Beis HaMikdash when Shabbos coincided with Yontif? Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Shechalios B'Shabbos Molichin Es Lulaveim Lahar Habayis. What people would do is, since originally the minhag was that the lulav was supposed to be taken on Shabbos when it coincides with the first day, everyone would have to bring their lulav before Shabbos to the Beis HaMikdash, and v'hachazonim mekablu mehen v'sojonos on al gabi itztaba. What they would do is they would lay out all of the lulavim on benches, on stone benches that were on a har habayis, and v'azikenim menichin shalahem belishka. And the elders of the community would have a special storage place, like they had their own lockers, like the big machers of the shul have special lockers. So the zikenim would be able to put it in a lishka, and everyone else put it in on these stone benches. And then what they told people to do is, look guys, it's going to be pandemonium tomorrow, so leave your lulav here, but if you don't get your lulav, don't worry about it. Just give it to your friend as a matana, and he'll give you his lulav as a matana. Don't worry about it. Now, this is different from what we saw in the previous parak when we were talking about bringing your esrog to shul, because there it's a much smaller oilam. So there, everyone would be able to recognize which esrog was his, which lulav was his. Over here, there's thousands upon thousands of people. It's simply not practical to have that expectation. So therefore, lamachar mashkim and uboyin. The next day, people would come to the Beis HaMikdash. There were so many thousands of Arba Minim, the attendants would just basically throw everything in front of the throngs of people. And people would get into fist fights. Hey, you took my lulav, right? And chaos would ensue. So ucheshero beis and shaboli de sakana hiskinu shiyu kol echad ve'echad notel bevesa. When the Beis Din saw that people were actually getting into physical altercations and there was actually SUKKAH involved, they said, you know what, from now on, no more lulav to be taken in the Beis HaMikdash on the first day. Never are we going to allow people to bring their lulav before Shabbos. From now on, you can bench lulav at home. It's not that we're telling you not to bench lulav on Shabbos. We're telling you bench it at home and come to the Beis HaMikdash empty-handed because we don't want to take the responsibility anymore.
It's only the first day of Shabbos.
Well, it seems like the original takana was any day that it was Shabbos you could bench lulav, but there was a special din that you would. Well, right. In other words, if you remember, if we go back to the Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag in the previous blot, Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Shielos B'Shabbos Kolacham Malichanas Luveim LeBeis HaKnesses. That you're right, Alan. It was originally only when the first day of Sukkot was on Shabbos we wanted everyone to bench lulav. So we did the same thing in the Beis HaMikdash. It seems like if it wasn't the first day, we would tell people you don't even have to bench lulav at all. And so originally we let everyone bring their lulav from before Shabbos. People got into fights. We told people bench lulav because it's the first day of Sukkot, but bench it at home. Fine. Okay. Amai. So the Gemara says, first of all, what's the big deal of handling a lulav on Shabbos? In other words, the Gemara's question is in general, what's the big problem of doing benching lulav on Shabbos bichlal? Tiltul ba'almahu v'lidchi Shabbos. Right? It's all you're doing is just picking up something that's muktzah at best, because maybe you want to argue that it's not a kli. So midioraisa, that's perfectly legitimate. So why did the rabbis forbid it? If there's a mitzvah of lulav all 7 days of Sukkot, why did the rabbis only make a special provision for the first day and not for all the other 7 days? I mean, the other 6 days. They should have made a rule that any day that Shabbos coincides with, even if it's not the first day, there's a provision to bench lulav in the Beis HaMikdash, because the laws of muktzah generally don't apply in the Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabba gezer Hashem yitlenu biyado v'yilech etzel baki lilmod v'yavirenu arba amos b'rshus harabim. The answer is not out of a muktzah concern, because that's easily obviated. The concern is what we're worried that a person's going to carry it. The rabbi said, we'll only allow you to bench lulav on the first day when it coincides with Shabbos, but if Shabbos coincides with any other day of Sukkot, even in the Beis Mikdash, we don't want you to bench lulav because we're scared you might be tempted to carry it arba amos and ask a friend to show you how to shake it. And that's why we're worried, and that applied even in the Beis HaMikdash. V'hainu taimid de shofar, v'hainu taimid de Megillah. And that's the very same reason why they said that you don't blow shofar on Shabbos when it coincides with Rosh Hashanah. And that's also the reason why, appropriate for Shushan Purim, because nowadays the only time that Purim can coincide with Shabbos is a Shushan Purim in Yerushalayim. The rabbis therefore also said that you can't lane Megillah on Shabbos because you may be tempted to carry it outside and ask someone to teach you how to lane the Megillah. We'll have to hold it here for today. When Menachem will continue.